I'm real happy to be here. I've been very aware of Tom and Kathy and Roger and Chestnuts for about the last 20 years. I came to the University of Missouri 21 years ago, and so we started to do, my colleague actually, Dr. Ken Hunt, started to do chestnut variety cultivar trials starting in 1996, 1997, 1998. And so I've been working with our chestnut program, both in orchard work as well as looking at the markets for quite a long time, and I've been active in an organization that you may or may not be aware of called the Chestnut Growers of America, which are just 100 and some odd folks that are all really dedicated to chestnut production, and so it's a good organization. They meet every single year. Listening to Tom, and I've listened to Tom before, and I think he could probably do stand-up because I like a lot of dry humor that comes out of his mouth. But as we have talked, and one reason they bring me up here as a foil is because we do things, we're not that far south. I'm sitting in Columbia, Missouri, which basically is I-70. We're right on I-70. So to drive up here was 400 and something miles straight, 200 and something miles straight. So, but the climate zones are a bit different, and as you'll see, we actually do and promote and grow chestnuts differently than everything you've heard this morning. And when Tom said, you know, what's the right spacing? Well, anything you want is good, but 20 by 20 is the right way. So the take-home lesson here is that there's more ways than one that you can do this. And you've heard one way that works here. And I'm going to describe a way that just not that far south seems to work really well for us. I wanted to take just a step back for 1 second. So I'm in the Center for Agroforestry. And agroforestry is a set of practices where you're integrating things together in systems, trees and crops, or trees and forages and livestock in design systems. So that's sort of the basis is to create these practices that are both good for the environment and also good for your pocketbook. We have a farm that's 30 miles west of Columbia called the Horticultural and Agroforestry Research Center, but that's a big long bunch of words, so we call it the Hart Farm. 660 acres, and it sits right along the Missouri River, and it has nice, deep, lush soil, so it's like transporting a bit of Iowa down into central Missouri. So it's good soils, and in the upland areas, you know, very deep, well-drained soils that are perfect for things like chestnut. And a lot of the conversation that was here this morning was, can I plant chestnuts here on the slope, on the north side, south side, upland frost zone, riparian area? You have to look at your overall farm, and ideally you'll pick the right crop for that right soil area, slope, aspect, etc. So it might be in the wetter areas you stay away from chestnuts, and you would think about elderberry. And in the upland, well-drained soils, as Tom said, just off the top of the slope, that might be where you want to put chestnuts. So you have to think about fitting the right niches with the right crops. And also thinking at the end and think back to the beginning, can I market it? What are the markets? How would I do that? Before you put a tree in the ground, it's good to give a lot of thought to the fact, can I sell this thing? Because you don't want to get into the ostrich business. There's been a lot of businesses where, you know, things look really great, but when you get to the reality, there's no money in it. So some of the things that we were looking at when we were starting to work with pecans, chestnuts, black walnuts, pawpaw, elderberry, and things like that down at our center was the fact that there was very little research other than southern pecans. There's very little research on any of these crops. So if you as a landowner are going to get engaged in that, and especially if you go back 10 and 20 years, you're taking a lot of risk because you don't know if there's a right cultivar or variety to plant, or how to plant, or how to grow, or how to fertilize, or how to harvest, or what the market is. A lot of information gaps that are really important, so it makes it very risky. And so one of those risks, of course, is getting the right plant material. So my colleague Ken Hunt basically gathered together grafted cultivated varieties of chestnut, 65 different ones, mainly Chinese, and stuck them at that Hart farm back in 1996, 1997, 1998. So we began this very long-term observing of how do these cultivated varieties perform in that River Hills soil, lush soil, and see how they go. And one of the concerns is not only will they grow there, but how do they survive in the hottest, driest summer? How do they survive when it's 37 below? If you're going to do a long-term tree crop, you really need to know that it's going to survive the most extreme years. So for all of those folks that are planting in those outer zones in Iowa, you're going to find out from what just happened this week whether this spring you have good trees or not. And if they all survive, you can be pretty confident that that's about as tough as Mother Nature's going to throw it. So there's a lot of folks who are or have been planting specialty nut crops and chestnuts with nursery stock that's sold by nurseries that say great things, but they may not be great materials. And they may be great materials in Columbia, Missouri, and terrible in Madison, Wisconsin, or even Des Moines, or Lincoln, Nebraska, or Central Ohio. Because a lot of the plant materials don't travel all that well north-south. They may not do well 120 or 240 miles away from where we tested them. So those are some of the limitations that we face. You also want to know that there's good detailed financial information about this. So if you're going to get into it, you have a realistic idea of what your inputs are and what the profit could be that you have. And nowadays, there's at least some reasonable degree of support for chestnuts. So all the information that you're learning from Tom and Kathy is long and hard-earned from the School of Hard Knocks, and they've made the mistakes that you don't have to, and we've done a lot of things so that other people don't have to start doing things that don't work. Okay? Our program, we try to the extent that we can handle it, look at this very comprehensively. So we want to look at selection and breeding and production and management and marketing, consumer research and financial decision tools and grower training and all these things, because all of those things need to be known for you to succeed in any one of these specialty crops. So we work a bit with chestnut and pecan and black walnut, and in the near future we're also going to start doing some hazelnut research, which we haven't done up till now, and we work a lot with elderberry, and we work with pawpaw as well. So our chestnut work, we've been testing cultivars and worked on ways to grow them in the orchard and how to manage and harvest. We've done a lot of market and consumer research. We want to provide that science behind the data so that when you do this, your risk is lowered to as much of a degree as possible. Also, continuing to increase consumer awareness, because we want to be able to sell our chestnuts in the marketplace. How many of you, before you came here today, had never tasted a chestnut? Okay? It's a biased group. You can't raise your hand.
Well, have not.
Have not tasted a chestnut. So we have a chestnut festival at our Hart farm every October. We've done it since 2003. And about 75% of the people that come through there every year never tasted a chestnut. They know that chestnut roasting on the open fire is a song, but they didn't know that they actually have something real that you can actually eat. But when we find that people who do buy them and test them, because we give out free samples, their buying patterns for chestnuts starts to go up. So if we're interested in all growing more chestnuts and having more markets, we need to find more American consumers, as Tom said, who are unfamiliar with the chestnut, that will become chestnut eaters. Even if they eat 2 pounds a year, that's a big difference compared to 0. So in our area, we have all along the Missouri River, from St. Joseph up in the northwest, right down to St. Louis, and then up and down the Mississippi, this area that's kind of like Iowa. They're hilly, deep lush soils, perfect for perennial tree crops and excellent for chestnut. And we have 3 million acres just in the River Hills. So what have we learned since 1996, 7, 8? We know that it grows really, Chinese chestnut grows really well here in the Midwest. And we know that for selected cultivars, and we work with grafted varieties, we have not really worked with the seedlings very much. We know that the yields can be very, very impressive, easily at 2,000 pounds an acre, potentially much higher than that. Okay? For our case, and Tom mentioned this, irrigation is very, very important. So chestnuts in general, and I'm going to show you an exception, the chestnuts in general, we always say they don't like wet feed. So if it's Missouri and it's a bottomland area, I say plant pecan. If it's a well-drained upland site, I say think about chestnut. But even though they like well-drained fertile soils, they also like a lot of moisture. And we had really good moisture in 2008 and 2009 and 2010, right as our chestnut grafted cultivars were becoming 10 years-ish of age, and the yields started to jump through the roof. And we had about 20% above normal rainfall those 3 years, 8, 9, and 10. So they do seem to like a lot of moisture, and we recommend anybody that plants a chestnut orchard in Missouri put in trickle irrigation. People ask, why not American chestnut? And there's, of course, the simple answer. The other answer is that it's 150 tall foot tree, and you can't really manage it for chestnuts. Okay, even though we love it. Something that you may or may not have ever seen, Robert Frost predicted how the chestnut blight may end in a poem that he wrote in 1936. And he said, will the blight end the chestnut? The farmers rather guess not. It keeps smoldering at the roots and sending up shoots till another parasite shall come to end the blight. And there is something called hypovirulence, where there is a virus that infects the fungus that helps heal the cankers. But that's another story. Okay. What about the chinkapin chestnut? Well, the problem with the chinkapin chestnut is that they're that big. So that's a Chinese chestnut, that's an American chestnut, and they're pea-sized, interesting, very important crop that is of interest, especially for wildlife, and they're very tasty. But if you're going to go in the market, you don't want to pick, 500 nuts per pound.
I've got a question in that.
Yeah.
Southern Missouri is one of the natural areas for
It
the
is.
Ozark chinkapin.
Yes.
But you don't point out Southern Missouri as perhaps an ideal place for the Chinese chestnut.
Well, so what I picked, when I showed those slides of the River Hill soils being excellent, that's because there's just huge acreages of that well-drained lush soil. But all throughout Missouri, there are pockets of really good soil. So you can grow Chinese chestnut very well in southwest Missouri as long as you're not on rocky or wet kind of soil. So if you have good ground, and we saw, how do you do soil maps this morning? If you have the right kind of soil, southwest Missouri is fine. I wasn't going into that kind of detail. All right, so I was asked to talk a bit about why cultivars versus why seedlings. We've heard, everything we've heard this morning is about seedlings, and seedlings work really well. And so I'm going to explain to you why we work with cultivated varieties. Cultivated varieties mean absolute predictable performance because these are asexually propagated trees. So every McIntosh apple, every Anjou pear, every Red Haven peach that you eat is asexually propagated from a mother tree that's a Red Haven peach or a McIntosh apple, where they take some budwood, some cyanwood from that tree that is a McIntosh, they graft it onto a rootstock, and it grows up into another McIntosh. It's exactly the same tree. You know exactly what you're going to get. So if you put in an orchard, chestnut orchard of Ching and Peach and Sleeping Giant, and they're all grafted trees, every one will be a winner from day one. You don't have to thin it out in 20 years wondering what are the best bets and what are not. There are downsides to it, but this is a way to get 100% winners if the grafts take. Okay? Every plant in the orchard will form almost exactly the same way. The other thing is that the cyanwood from these producing trees is mature wood. Trees have immature wood when they're young, just like children before puberty can't reproduce. And then when you get into your teens, you can. Trees actually have juvenile wood and adult wood, and it's the adult wood that is flowering and fruitful. So if you take flowering and fruitful adult wood from a mother tree and you graft it onto a rootstock, it's already physiologically mature, so it starts to bear almost right away. As soon as it starts to grow up and branch out a little bit and have some energy, it starts to bear. They bear faster than seedlings bear because they don't have to go through juvenility. They already did that. Okay? So you initiate nuts production sooner than with seedlings, And once you start to produce some trees that you like, whether they're named cultivars or your own favorite trees, you can then take grafts from those trees and you can reproduce them exactly by grafting your own orchard of your favorite chestnut, whether that's a chain or your own. So you can go asexual anytime you want if grafting works in your area. Okay? Seedlings take typically 3 to 5 years longer than grafted trees. That's because you're starting with juvenile wood and not adult wood. The other thing about seedlings is that if my wife and I have 100 children and they're all sitting around this room, they are not all going to look like us, right? But if we cloned one of them 100 times, God forbid, we'd have 100 of them all exactly the same. And that's what we're talking about with cultivar orchards. Everyone performs the same. If you have 100 seed from a chain tree, there's going to be 100 variations of how those seedlings perform relative to the chain itself. A very small percent will probably be better than the original, and a percent will be as good, and quite a percent will be less good than the chain itself, or the sleeping giant, or the Louisvilles Monster. Okay, so if you're interested in if seedlings work for you, and again you plant at a tight spacing, and then over time you thin out the unproductive ones, well, that works. But another way to go is to plant a row, and every single one is a winner, and that's grafted. Okay. The other thing is with nut quality and yield and all the other parameters, when they are clonally propagated, if all of the things are good in that tree, if the yields are good and the nuts are sweet and the performance is consistent, etc., then every one that you put out there will behave just like that. Okay. Downsides, cultivars cost a whole lot more money than seedlings. I mean, we sell seed. You can buy seed from us and raise them in your own garden and create your own planting for very, very little money if you're willing to invest all that time. Or you can buy seedlings from Red Fern Farm and other places that are far less expensive than a grafted tree, which in fact may not survive when you plant it because they have to be babied. Another way to do it, of course, is to plant seedlings and get your hands on some clonal material or plant just a few grafted trees and then do your own grafting over time. You can top work your seedlings and put on any kind of cultivar you want over time. The biggest drawback is that cultivars can die. So I am taking some tissue from a mature tree and I'm grafting it onto a rootstock, and there's that graft union, and there is a chance that that graft union can fail. Okay? If that fails, that doesn't mean that the rootstock is dead, and it may send up suckers, and often when you see suckers, it's because the graft union is beginning to fail. But that is something that you don't have with seedlings. Right? You don't have a graft, you don't have a graft union, you don't have a graft failure. So that's a potential downside. The other thing is that cultivars are not as vigorous. They're vigorous. They can put on 6 feet a year, even as a cultivar when they're younger, but they're not as vigorous as seedlings. They need more TLC. Okay? So those are just the realities of working with cultivars. A little more picky, a little more TLC, but you know what you're going to get. Here's an example of a picture from Michigan State University where they've got some seedling trees that are 10 years old and some grafted. This is a different cultivar called Colossal that's 6 years old, and this is heavily bearing, and this is yet to produce anything. Okay, just a kind of an extreme example of showing what a seedling tree would be, because it turns out to be not an early or precocious one next to a graft that's just bearing like crazy, because you know what you're going to get. So one of the things we did, as I mentioned, is that Ken established 65 different named cultivated varieties collected from all the northern nut growers and the amateur chestnut enthusiasts, especially Empire Chestnut Company, from coast to coast that we could get our hands on. And we stuck them in this one location in the Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Center. And then a couple years later, we took a subset of that and we put in 5 individuals of the same cultivar in a replicated trial. And then a little bit later, we created a commercial orchard with just 3 different cultivars that were replicated. And so those are really the 3 main sites. And the 4th one, we did a pollination flow study, and that's where we found that You can be as far out as 60 feet between the trees and get reasonable pollination, but beyond 60, it really drops off fast. Now, the bigger the trees get, the further they can be apart. So little ones, 60 feet's too far apart. But if you have a 30-year-old tree and it's 60 feet to the next 30-year-old tree, there's going to be a ton of pollen and you shouldn't have any problems at all. So this is our germplasm repository. We started out at a 30 by 30 foot spacing, and why did Ken Hunt pick 30 by 30 foot spacing? I think he pulled it out of the air, let's call it that. Pulled it out of the air. And so we have ours under trickle irrigation, and there's just a whole big mixture of different cultivars in there because we just had one or two individuals of all these different named cultivars because we didn't know how they would do, what would do well and what wouldn't do well, and so we had to look at them year after year after year. Whoops. This is one of the cultivars that we're interested in of more recent vintage that is not pure Chinese chestnut, but is quite interesting, and it's called Sago. This was how it looked when it was about 10 years old. So this is the germplasm repository, and I just made a little bit larger fonts for some of the ones that are the more well-known cultivars that we have recommended because they're pretty good. Core, Ching, Gideon, Peach, Mossbarger, things like that. The vast majority of those that are really small, of the 65, we only really recommend about 6 or 7. So we put the time in to find out that most of them weren't all that great. They had one problem or another. When they were young, say age 3, 4, and 5, and they put out those 3 and 5 and 6 and 8 burrs, we would have huge chestnuts, 20 grams, 25 grams, 30 grams, thinking, wow, these are awesome. But as soon as they hit that point of inflection where they started to go up to 25 pounds, 40 pounds, some of those, the production went from 20 grams to 5 grams. So we didn't like that. All right, so they went from the good list to the bad list. We also have been working with folks that can do the molecular genetic background on these, molecular fingerprinting, because if we're going to ultimately, first of all, know that a cultivar is a cultivar and it isn't an accidental mistake that somebody put the wrong tree in the wrong place and named it Ching when it's really Auburn Super. If you do the molecular fingerprint, you know what's what. And also, if you start a crossing program, you can also verify from a seedling, you know who's mom because you collected it under mom. But when you do the genetic fingerprint, you will also be able to figure out who's dad. Even if you don't do the pollination yourself, if you have everything fingerprinted, you can figure out who's dad. So you can let Mother Nature do the crossing and just save the seed of the crosses that you want. And we've done that in our black walnut breeding program. The next orchard I wanted to mention was our cultivar trial. It looks pretty much the same, 30 by 30 foot spacing. And in 5 of these rows, each row is filled with 5 replications of a limited number of chestnut cultivars. And now that that trial is also 17 years old, and we've collected data year after year after year, this year I finally talked to my colleague Aaron Templemeyer and others at the Hart Farm, and I said, we're going to get rid of a whole bunch of these because the purpose was to test them to see which ones do really well. So a number of them are doing really well, a number of them are poor, so we're just off with their heads. They go away. We keep a couple copies of it in our germplasm repository, and we're going to fill that collection with new material that we haven't really checked out yet. So we collected data year on year, and as I mentioned, 2008, 2009, and 2010 were really good years. And then again, if you compare to 2015, so at age 12, a cultivar like Ching is producing 53 pounds on average per tree. We plant, and again, this is just, it's really arbitrary, but we've picked 30 by 30 foot spacing. And in Columbia, Missouri, or at the Hart Farm, by the time they're 15 years old, they're crowded. So you have to start thinning, even at 30 by 30, because the trees grow that well. But between 2011 and 2015, Ching went from 53 pounds on average to a tree to 94 pounds per tree. So by 12, they had not yet really reached peak production. And so here at age 16, they did extremely well. So at 30 by 30 foot spacing, that's roughly 50 trees to the acre. 40 pounds of production per tree means a ton. okay? So 94 pounds means well over 2 tons per acre, pushing on 5,000 pounds. And then Sleeping Giant was producing 25 pounds on average at age 12, and at age 16 was 66 pounds. And then there was a cultivar that Greg Miller has developed out of Empire Chestnut Company called Peach. Why would you call a chestnut a peach? But it's a little fuzzy, so and there's a pawpaw cultivar called Mango, so go figure. Anyway, Greg Miller was really high on peach. It produces a nice, large chestnut. But up through age 12, I kept saying to Greg Miller, I'm sorry, Greg, I think peach is only good for the homeowner. It never produces. So at 12 years old, it's producing 14 pounds per tree. And I'm thinking, come on, Greg. He said, stick with us, stick with us. Well, we weren't going to cut it down. Age 16, 70 pounds. So it's delayed puberty. That's all I can think of. So peach really does produce really, really well, but it took a little bit longer to know that. Okay? So we have this long-term data. And we also are looking at the nut weights, and we like to see nuts that are 12 grams or larger. And a lot of these favorite cultivars not only yielded well, but the nut size stayed fairly large, as opposed to tanking, like the cultivar Willamette, which just tanked. Okay? Another thing was, how do they break out when you put them through one of those chestnut sizers? Do you have a bunch of tiny little chestnuts, or do you have a lot of medium-sized chestnuts, or do you have big chestnuts? So when you size those out, you can see that Sleeping Giant, 96% of them were extra large. So everything it produced almost was excellent. Hong Kong, only a quarter of them were extra large, so it doesn't produce as many really big chestnuts. So you can go further and further and further and decide, you know, with enough data, what kind of tree you want for what reasons. You might not want extra large, so you would favor a different cultivar. You might like it, and you would favor a different cultivar. So Sago, S-Z-E-G-O, is one of those that was one of the last ones that Ken put in. We only have one bearing matured sago in our germplasm repository, and it was one of the last ones he grafted in 2005. But I really started to take note of it when it was about 10 years old, and it was cranking out over 50 pounds of nuts, and they were over 20 grams. Okay, so that's something that we've been watching, and we're now starting we've taken some of our own sago and grafted it, and we're putting it out in further testing. Okay, so it's not pure Chinese. It's Japanese times chinkapin times Chinese, but it turns out to have really, really big nuts. There's one drawback for sago, at least in my opinion. Some of the cultivars, the burrs open up on the tree and drop the nuts free. Some of the cultivars, the burrs are still closed when they hit the ground. Okay? When they drop the nuts free, you can go there either mechanically or with your nut wizard and just pick them right up. With sago, you have to have good shoes on, and I'm kicking open every burr to pop those nuts out. Burr after burr after burr. It takes me 5 times as long to harvest under a sago as it takes me to harvest under a Sleeping Giant. Does that now also. So, and I've noticed that our mechanical harvester, which picks up chestnuts very nicely and very quickly, it doesn't bust the burr open. Okay. The good thing about that is they stay fresh and moist much, much longer in that nice womb of a burr on the ground. Whereas when they're free from the burr, you got to pick them up even faster. But they can sit on the ground for 3 or 4 days in that sago burr and still be very moist and in perfect condition when the burr is opened up enough so you can kick it open and get them out. Okay? The nuts store well, the nuts are sweet, they peel easily, they're cold hardy. The big question is, what about chestnut blight? All of the Chinese chestnuts that are pure Chinese, we've seen no problem with blight, and we have had blight in our orchard, and I was glad to see it because we want to know that blight is not a problem for our trees. But sago is a complex hybrid, and it has some blight susceptibility in its genes. There it is. So there's a picture of swollen, orange-colored branches and broken bark it's reacting to the blight, but it's not dying from the blight. So it doesn't have sunken cankers and it isn't falling apart, but something that concerns me. And that's why we get to look at this for a long time before you have to worry about it. So maybe it's okay. Maybe it can tolerate this and grow. So far, so good, but maybe not. Okay. Some more good news. We've just hired, starting in June of 2019, a new tree breeder who's super enthusiastic about chestnuts. So we're actually going to be very involved in not just evaluating cultivars, but beginning to cross cultivars that have a combination of really great traits to create new cultivator varieties in the future, including material that Tom Wall and Kathy Dice have, that Greg Miller has, and that other people have, that they may share with us, saying this is great for all these years and this is the reason, and we can bring it into our collection. Okay. There's a whole bunch of cultivars from a guy named Mike Nave that he's also going to provide us that will add to our collection. So we're not satisfied with what we have, since we only have just over half a dozen that we really think are excellent. So there's a whole bunch of fun names like Jenny, Emmeline's Purple, Nanjing Special, ABC Red WC, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to be adding to our collection to continue to have a good diversity of germplasm out there. And then these are things from Mike Nave. He really likes Jenny. He says it's one of the best, largest sized, vigorous, good tasting, early dropping nuts. And he likes Emmeline's Purple and he likes WC, but we're just going to start with those right now. Okay. And then we have what I call a commercial production orchard. We only have 3 cultivars in there that are all good. One is called Ching, one is called Peach, and one is called Core, K-O-H-R. So all the nuts that are cross-pollinating in this orchard actually turn out to be pretty good producers. So this is established more along the lines of a commercial production orchard, and we've added a couple new rows of sago here because we want to start looking at sago. Okay, and that's how that orchard looks. It's actually too close. Anytime the trees begin to touch tip to tip, it's too close, and you got to thin, prune or thin. Okay, and that's how that orchard looks, where we have these 3 tree plots and replicated 8 times, etc. This was our hill orchard where we did that pollen flow study, where we're able to find out that when you go beyond 60 feet, you have a whole bunch of blanks. Okay. One of the attributes that cuts down on chestnut yield is the fact that we are talking about Castanea mollissima. These come from China. This is not native to the United States. And they arrived in the US and they arrived in Missouri, and we don't know what the origin of them in China is. But Chinese chestnut grows from the equivalent, let's say, of Chicago to Jacksonville, Florida. That's that wide of a distribution where Chinese chestnut grows in China. So if I want to grow chestnut in Missouri and it was native to Kentucky, I would grow the Kentucky stuff because it's similar to a climate like ours. I wouldn't pick the Michigan stuff and I wouldn't pick the Florida stuff. But we have all these cultivars and we don't know, did they come from the equivalent of Florida in China or Michigan in China or Missouri in China? My suspicion is that they came from South China. And the reason that we know that is because we get into October and these things are still flowering. I don't think they're interested in sex that much. They just think the growing season is going to be another 2 months long. So they'll flower and set and produce a burr. And they'll flower a second time and produce a second burr. And then at the time when you think, gee, it's just about the frost, they're flowering again. All those flowerings take energy away from the first burr's production. So you don't really want that. And that's something we want to avoid in the future. Couple of interesting things about this one cultivar that I know Tom likes quite a bit. It's a heavy producer and it's not pure Chinese. It's called Louisvilles Monster. And it behaves like European chestnuts because it's male sterile. So it produces female flowers. It produces non-fruitful male catkins, but it gets heavily pollinated by all the Chinese chestnuts in our orchard. Heavy bearer. So we think in the future it might be useful to find crosses where we can have Chinese chestnuts in some cases that are male sterile, put them in with other producing Chinese chestnut, produce pollen, and then have very, very high quality, high yielding chestnut trees.
So of all those 65, we just have this small handful that we really think are pretty good. We like Ching, we like Sleeping Giant, we like Gideon, Core, Mossbarger, Homestead, Peach, Sago maybe, Ching Su, which is we're going to investigate from Redfern Farm because they think it has a lot of promise, and those other ones, okay? And this is how our orchards looked when they were younger. We have everything under trickle irrigation. Another one of the cultivars that we liked that I mentioned was Sleeping Giant. We've had Sleeping Giant trees that produced 120 pounds per tree. So they have the capacity to yield quite a bit. That was at 16 years old. And all those nuts dropped free and just fantastic to have to pick those up, okay? That's a Louisvilles Monster, and I want to show you something that's unique. Chinese chestnut hate wet feet. It took me, I can't tell you how long it took me for a light bulb to hit my head. We have 2 Louisvilles Monsters at present on our farm in the germplasm repository. For many years, I've been picking up Louisvilles Monster nuts in the water under the tree. And it finally dawned on me just last year that, oh my God, this tree has been sitting in water many, 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 many years, and it has never had any kind of blight problem, any kind of death. It just tolerates sitting in water. Chestnuts hate to sit in water. Why is Louisvilles Monster continuing to produce year in and year out and sitting in water? So there might be something unique about Louisvilles Monster where the idea that never let it get wet feet isn't exactly a problem. I don't know. But just was something that I don't know why I didn't think about it when I'm sloshing around in water and getting the chestnuts out from below the water. We use a different approach to growing chestnuts than you heard this morning in Missouri. We don't use tubes. We use 5-foot woven wire cages anchored down by rebar, and we're planting grafted trees. 30 by 30 foot spacing. We have a nice, clean, weed-free zone. We don't really use this offset design. We use just a straight row design. But that's the way we do it. We've used 30 by 30 foot spacing. I think, you know, the 20 by 20 can make sense, especially if you have the gumption to thin them out. But if you're planting cultivars, every tree is a winner. So if you do it that way, you have to have the guts to cut out highly producing trees in order for them to still have sunlight. Because to have a successful heavy bearing chestnut, it has to have sunlight all the way around. And as soon as it starts to cross, all the lower branches self-prune, and you're just basically like yielding on the top of the umbrella, and everything down inside is no longer bearing. So you really are losing heavy in your production if you let them get too close. We also, again, put on drip irrigation, and we recommend that people put up a tall deer fence. So, you know, rather than worrying, because that's the only way you can really not have buck rub. You get the tree up and it's 12 feet tall and everything's great and there's no more problems, and then you have deer in there and they still have that bend into the stem as Tom was talking about, and buck rub is super damaging. So some of our producers have just said, heck with it, in various words, and they put up a 10-foot fence and they have 0 deer. Now these woven wire cages, I'll show you a picture a little later, there's no bunny damage and there's no deer damage, and there's 5 feet tall just like the tubes are, and the trees just go. But we do stake, we use a 10-foot steel stake to hold that chestnut up until it's got some diameter so that it can stand on its own. But that's a different approach. So you can do this staggered way so you have more sunlight per tree. But what we recommend is for grafted trees, planting them in double rows. So like 2 rows of core, 2 rows of Ching, 2 rows of core, and 2 rows of Ching. And why do we do that? Because each core is pollinated on one side only 30 feet away by a different cultivar. And on this side, again, by a different cultivar. So we have no pollen problems at all by doing 2 rows of the same cultivar and 2 of the next and 2 of the next. But it makes harvesting easier because we know when those 2 rows are all going to drop at the same time. So it makes harvest easier. We don't want to have a core and then a Ching and then a Peach and then a Sleeping Giant, because every one of those is dropping at a different time. So if you want to minimize your time out in the orchard, picking them up or mechanically picking them up, and they're in rows, and the rows are organized. It makes life simpler. Okay? These are the cages we use, but we don't use these big, heavy things. We use rebar. The nice thing about rebar also is that you can just slide the cage right up, because rebar's round, right? So you can just slide the cage right up and work under there and get weeds out or whatever you need to do and slide the cage right back down. And it's also easy to get rebar out of the ground because it doesn't have any kind of a, fish hook on the bottom that makes it resistant to pull up. So you just use 3/8-inch, 4-foot long, anchored 2 feet in the ground and weave it into the cage on both sides. And at least in our area, that's strong enough to hold them still. But maybe we don't have the same kind of wind issues. Okay? That's my colleague Ken Hunt, and he's up on a ladder. And we, invested quite a bit in getting the pruning up over time. We don't prune it right away, but we slowly move that up so it's tall enough so you can drive a tractor under it over time. And then you get the scaffolding to grow out at 7 or 8 or 9 feet above the ground. Okay? I'm just going to talk on a couple things that we will also talk on. And of course, people know that you can use the little nut wizard to pick up nuts. And when you have your first 1,000 or 2,000 pounds, you could pick them all up by yourself. But when a tree itself is producing 120 pounds and you've got acres of them, it's not going to happen. Okay? So then you need to go to some kind of a mechanical harvester, and they range. These are vacuum harvesters. We've tried to use Savage pecan harvesters, but they don't really work well because they use these rubber fingers. And for things like a pecan, they'll roll right into the belt and roll right in and you pick them up. But chestnuts typically have a flat side. So those rubber fingers often just push them and punch them down to the ground, and that does not work. These harvesters that we use suck them out of the ground. They're a vacuum like a street sweeper, and they suck them in and they separate the burr bits from the nuts and put them in bags on the side. And we can harvest many hundreds of pounds per hour as you go up and down the rows. The trick is you still have to be careful because you don't want to run over the nuts and smash them. You don't want to drive in circles around the tree, and that requires a lot of education of people to know how to do it right. So we bought a PTO tractor-pulled medium model that's an Italian harvester for $30,000. And I used to think, wow, that's a ton of money. And then I went to Josh and Lauren Payne's farm. Where are you guys? Way in the back there. I went to their farm, and then Josh took us into their big, what's it called, a shed, a garage, an outbuilding. And he said, well, this cost us $400,000. This is for, big ag. And I thought, $400,000? So I thought, geez, $30,000 for a FACMA is now nothing. So now I'm not so paranoid about it, now that I know what real money is in agriculture. You do have to have a clean orchard floor. You can't have a whole bunch of sticks laying in the floor because it'll jam up the machine. So it does require, some orchard maintenance. There was no mention of some of the nasty issues you have to deal with because this is a living system other than the Japanese beetles. But on our farm, unfortunately, in the last few years, and certainly in a lot of places out east, there is a weevil that will infect the chestnut, and it oviposits when the nuts are still in the burr up in the tree. Okay. Now, the good news is there is both an organic control, which it means as soon as the nuts drop, you bring them in and you put them in a hot water bath, literally. You put them in a jacuzzi at about 119 degrees for 20 minutes, and even if there's a microscopic little tiny weevil in there, it kills it as it is, and nobody's the wiser. Okay? And then the nut's still alive, so it's not a dead nut. The other way to do it, and we've unfortunately resorted to this because we don't have the jacuzzi set up at our farm, we use the nasty chemical called 7, which is in the name, the trade name is Warrior. But we started to spray because we did have a weevil buildup, and so we want to make sure we get rid of that. The problem is if you let any nuts sit on the floor of your orchard and weevils show up, the weevil is in the nut, and within just a few days it fattens up to a nice little juicy thing over there, and then it drops into the soil about a foot deep, and it will sit there for 1 to 2 years before it completes its life cycle and starts the whole thing again. So once you have it, it's going to take you a few years to get rid of it of either really good sanitation and water baths or using Warrior. So we'll be hitting ours with Warrior for the next few years, though I am encouraging my colleagues to get the jacuzzi method also set up so that we can demonstrate the organic production method. We also have on the Center for Agroforestry's website a financial support decision tool. So you can play with all kinds of different parameters on site prep and spacing and layout and quality and planting stock, thinning, fertilization, etc. And you'll end up coming up with various parameters like internal rate of return and years to break even. Okay, so that's available as an Excel spreadsheet that you can download and play with at your leisure. Okay. When I talk about agroforestry, we talk about not just planting the trees, but what are you going to do with all the ground while the trees are this tall and there's just a whole bunch of bare ground there. Okay, that's where intercropping, whether you want to pop in a pawpaw or whether you want to intercrop between the trees. Okay, so here is a couple that's maybe located 30 or 40 miles from Hark and went through our chestnut training 10 years ago and heard all about agroforestry. So they put in the trees in the cages, and what they did was they planted chestnut seedlings and then they top worked those to the cultivars. So they let the seedlings size up for 1 full year till they got thumb size thickness, nice robust seedlings. And then they came in the next year and they top worked them to the cultivars. So that's how they did it. They did not buy grafted cultivars. They grafted in the field, and that worked for them really well. They went to a 20 by 20 spacing. In the first 2 years, they grew pumpkins. So the pumpkins grew up all around the chestnuts and up the cages and everything else. And then they harvested and sold a ton of pumpkins. Okay, and then they decided, okay, we don't want to do that because they're climbing up the cages. So then they said, okay, we'll plant sweet corn. And they interplanted sweet corn. There's still tons of sunlight there. The chestnuts are babies. And then they said, okay, well, we don't really want to do sweet corn anymore. So they said, let's do winter wheat. Winter wheat is a beautiful crop to combine with nut crops, because nut crops are maturing in August, September, October, and harvesting at that time. Winter wheat you plant in the fall after the nuts drop. You harvest it by early summer, way before the trees are really getting busy. Very compatible, and you know, you get, when the trees are young, you get really very, very good yields. And that also means when you design the spacing between your rows, you have to say, what's the size of my equipment to plant whatever it is you want to plant? So if your minimum row width is going to be 45 feet, well, then your trees can't be 20 feet apart. Otherwise, you can't use your equipment. So you need to factor these things in before you actually get the trees in the ground. But they've been growing winter wheat and chestnuts together for about 5 years. They've also taken our recommendation for trickle irrigation further, and they've installed fertigation. So they can actually pump nitrogen through the system, and their trees are incredibly green and productive. I haven't seen that before, but they just did it, and it's working for them. Okay, this is how their orchard looks early in the year, just before they're ready to harvest their winter wheat. Okay, the trees are actually getting into a bearing stage, but the wheat's going to be gone months before the trees, the nuts are dropping. And so the other nice thing about wheat is you can cut the wheat really to a short stubble, and it makes a good pickup surface for picking up chestnuts, not commercially, not with the FACMA harvester, but with the Nut Wizard. Still very compatible. Okay. It provides you a nice ground cover. I just wanted to mention a couple more things, since most people may not be familiar. There's 1 million products in the market that use chestnut. So most of the chestnut sales are just fresh chestnuts from me to the consumer. But there's all kinds of value-added product opportunities. And if you go to Italy, Italy is chestnut cuisine paradise. There are 1 million things that they do with chestnuts in Italy. So there's beer, there's puree, there's liqueurs, there's flowers. In France, there's marron glacé. They cook them in soups and dumplings and breads, and they cook with all kinds of main meats, and they ferment them into all kinds of delicious dishes. I went to an international chestnut conference in Portugal already 15 years ago, and there was a professor from Florence who brought posters. When you go to a conference, you often will bring a poster about your work, a poster. This guy brought 37 posters all about chestnut, and about a dozen of them were all about chestnut food. So one of them, and he had cooked every one of these himself. Each of these is a different dish, every single one. So this is Chestnut's first course. This is Chestnut's second course. This is Chestnuts for dessert. This is Chestnuts and drinks and liqueurs. This is what he called industrial products at the pastry shop. So, you know, there's an unbelievably large amount of things that they do with chestnut in Europe that we could also do here. Okay, a couple more things as I close. We have a planning and design handbook, which is available for download on our website, which basically is just a think-through tool. So as you go through it, it helps you think through from your own objectives and what you know and what your equipment is and what your network is, what your soils are, what your climate is, what things you might want to work together on to think through, is this going to have a good market, et cetera. And it's a think-through tool. There's lots of similar ones, but this is one we've developed for agroforestry as a think-through tool. It's called the Handbook for Agroforestry Planning and Design. We also have, last slide, we have an online master's degree in agroforestry, and every summer we have a crash course. It's called the Agroforestry Academy. It's a 5-day course, and it's actually fairly pricey unless you're a military veteran, in which case we can give you a full scholarship. Costs $1,000, and you come on Sunday night and stay till Friday, and we work through learning about all the agroforestry practices, and we talk about markets and economics and all these other things. And we also then work with a farm family and go to their farm and get their input and get their ideas, and then we break into groups and we design ideas for agroforestry for their farm. So it's a hands-on way to get experience to help think through, take that planning and design manual and try to put it into practice. Yeah. Beautiful. Yes?
Is it Spain that has that wasp leaving that gall?
All right, so that's a nasty pest that we don't have yet, but it's in Ohio. And that's called the chestnut gall wasp. Right. And so far there's no really great way to control that. So that's a teeny tiny little wasp that will oviposit into both the leaf bases and the growing tips of your chestnuts and cause these round galls and really hammer your production. So Greg Miller from Empire Chestnut Company in Ohio has it full bore. He lost 2 years of production in like 2011 and 2012, and then it seemed to resolve itself, and I thought, okay, it's fine, but it came back again 3 or 4 years later, and so I dread the day, but it'll probably happen when it finds its way out here. And hopefully, as a research institution, we can figure out what to do, or maybe the growers will figure out what to do so we know how to cope with the thing better. But it's nasty. It came from abroad. Yes?
In France, they're starting to release another, or a biocontrol. I don't know if it's a wasp
Right.
or something.
Right. So there is a ichneumotid parasitic wasp out of Japan that is released, but it's so far it's only seemed to help it just cycle. So it doesn't just stay epidemic, but it hasn't basically so far here in this country just like keeps it low. Not yet. But that's the right approach. Right. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a comment and question. First comment is, it'd be nice if there was a more standard way to describe varieties. From the cheap seats, you know, everybody has a way of saying it, but it's hard to understand, you know, to quantify it. I mean, there's adjectives and adverbs, but how do we quantify varieties? And so I'd like to see, as the industry matures, people that are, you know, running the industry or driving in the direction, be able to standardize that so we can understand better the differences in similarities between varieties.
Right. So how do we quantify varieties? We're we're a long way from that, and we're even a long way from, because of what you heard this morning and from what I just said, whether it's going to be using seedlings of good. So in other words, Tom Wall likes the progeny of a lot of our good cultivars as seedling material, and because they seem to be really good genetics. But then they don't have to deal with any of these graft and failure problems. And so some of our favorite cultivars, like Sleeping Giant that I said produced 120 pounds, and I've seen it on Redfern Farm, and it's just not thriving. And I don't know why. Great soils, etc. But you know, in our case, I think if you're dealing specifically with a cultivar, yes, we will be able to describe exactly what makes a ching as we go forward.
In your comment there leads to my question. I'm listening to two very
Different.
expert gentlemen in the industry with very firm but different. And so from my perspective, I'm having a really hard
Yeah.
time.
So let me clarify. The-
I would love to hear you guys kind of debate.
well, we will. That's part of the whole show here. And I don't want to be Sean Hannity either, so I'm not going to be. But so what I've learned is that so far there's not a right way, right? There isn't a right way. From the horticulture perspective, there's no crop that you grow as a seedling crop commercially. They're not out there. Okay, so you know, when we started to work with chestnuts, we thought, well, you work with cultivated varieties. You work with cultivated varieties of apples and peaches and pecans. And so why wouldn't we work with known, consistent, reproducible, guaranteed to produce cultivars? But, you know, my colleague in Ohio, Greg Miller, has been doing this since the 70s. And he's very familiar with cultivars, and in his area, he's kind of given up on cultivars and he works on seedling trees. He says that there's a very high heritability of good traits between a mother tree and a seedling tree. And so he's willing to just do the thinning thing, right? Whereas my feeling is, and we can probably push the numbers too, you want to start out from day one with a best bet right down every row. Okay, but if they don't thrive in your area, so here's part of the problem. I mentioned that I think that most of this germplasm is from southern China. It's not necessarily designed to work from Iowa. So if we could go back to China and collect from central and northern China good cultivars, those may be the Wisconsin, Minnesota, northern Iowa cultivars that would thrive and do great. But we don't have that material, so we're a little bit shy, or a lot shy on the research side. I'd also like to see replicated trials in Columbia, Missouri, and Ames, Iowa, and Madison, Wisconsin, and you know, all the land grants. But most of the land grants won't touch this stuff. Fortunately, our Center for Agroforestry, they leave us to do what we do, and they're happy. Yeah.
For those of us that are growing our own nursery stock, is there any risk, and if so, is there any measures to take to prevent introducing things like chestnut weevil from purchasing through seed sources where they do currently have chestnut?
Yeah, so there's no worry about weevil. Weevil was only going to come in when you have bearing trees. There is worry about gall wasp, right? So you have to be super careful about buying material, even though I love Greg Miller and I think he's fantastic. I'm afraid to buy material from Empire Chestnut Company because there may be gall wasp in some of those seedlings, and then all you've done is help it move 400 miles west.
Is that just with seedling trees, or is that with seed nuts as well?
No, so the gall wasp is not in the nut. Okay, so there's no problem with the nut. And if you purchased nuts, for example, from the center, and God forbid they might have had a weevil, that's not going to be a viable nut, and you're not going to introduce weevil into your area that way. So,
But if you plant nuts that have weevils in them, those weevils get down in the soil.
right, but by the time you plant those nuts, those weevils are probably going to have already become large entities and gutted that nut, and it's not going to be a viable nut.
Yeah, the nut won't be viable, but the weevils might.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, but you're not likely to do anything with that nut. I mean, it's not likely you're going to. I think. Because by the time those nuts are just a couple of weeks old, those weevils have gotten large and maybe even exited out of the plastic bag. So I mean, it's possible, but it's not real likely. I wouldn't worry so much on seed, but it's possible. Yeah.
When I got interested in buying chestnuts again, I contacted the Washington Chestnut Company in Washington, and there was a
Burnt Ridge.
nursery, and I corresponded with the guy that said, hey, I'm just going to buy a whole bunch of your stuff and see what it looks like here. And he wrote me back, and he specifically said, Michael, we are sold out of marigold. May I suggest we purchase the following seedlings grafted, the following chestnut blight-resistant European cultivars, and he gave me a list. And then he Japanese, European varieties over
Yeah.
Chinese.
So to complicate the story further, it's a very complicated story because there's three major commercial species. There's a Japanese chestnut crenata, there's a Chinese chestnut mellissima, and there's a European chestnut Castanea sativa. Okay, those crenata, Japanese, European ones really do well in Mediterranean climates. That's really where they're designed for. Okay, you have to be. They're not cold hardy. I mean, you're really taking. So the people there are people in Michigan. If the co-op has laid a bet on Colossal, which is let's call it the red delicious apple of chestnuts. It's very productive. I don't know that it's anything particularly special. There are other like Marjoul and Marsal and others that I think are more highly regarded as European Japanese crosses. There is a potential for them to get blight, but they're also going to be male sterile. So you have to have a pollinator or pollenizer. With Chinese, you don't have to worry about that. The other thing, again, is very much to do with climate, because those are not set up for any kind of cold. So in Michigan, where they've laid this bet on, along the west coast of Michigan is a zone 6, very narrow, a couple miles wide, where all the cherries and blueberries and all of their fruits grow. You go 20 miles inland, you're in zone 4. So you're basically setting yourself up for failure. And if your pollenizer doesn't thrive, you've got nothing, right? You have to not only have the colossal, but you have to have the pollen source elsewhere, and that's a problem. They've also had a problem in Michigan with something called internal kernel breakdown. And so you got to make sure that there's no Chinese chestnut pollen anywhere nearby, or you get a beautiful looking nut that is actually blackened inside that's no good. Okay, so where are you located?
I'm near Lincoln, Nebraska. And he knew that when we were corresponding.
I would call that blowing smoke. I think that's a big mistake. You can try it. I mean, we have Bouche de Bédazac and Marsal and Marjoul, etc. And we've got those at our farm because we thought we'll take a look. I think Bouche de Bédazac is not too bad. Now, we're in Columbia, Missouri, but most of them have failed. And some of them, even in our longer growing season, it was too late. We even got frost before they were ready. So we've decided that we can grow colossal great where we are, but we've just laid our bets on Chinese, and we don't have to deal with any of those issues or any issues of cold hardiness or recommendations for growers or that they have to have a pollenizer, and it can't be a Chinese pollenizer because it causes internal kernel breakdown.
What does frost, like an early frost or a freak frost, do to chestnuts?
Okay, that's never happened to us, but that's happened over to Redfern Farm. So what happens when you get an early frost? It kills it ferments the nuts on the tree? What does it do?
A frost isn't a big issue, but if you get a hard freeze before the nuts are ripe, if the internal temperature of the nut falls to 24 Fahrenheit, the nut will be killed. And then as soon as it warms back up again, later that same day after that early morning hard freeze, the nut starts to decay. And alcohol will start forming, and you can smell alcohol in the air around the trees. But the nuts are ruined. You can't sell them. Even the squirrels won't eat them.
So that's never happened where we are. And I just by quirk of luck, we're far enough south that it's only a matter of a few degrees that it could be 31 degrees in Columbia and fine, and 26 degrees, at Redfern Farm and not fine. It's pushing at the edge. Yes?
When you do the alley cropping with that ritter wheat, then if you did that system, you couldn't use the mechanical vacuum, that wouldn't work?
You'd be picking up a whole lot of little bits of straw. You probably could actually still use the harvester on the stubble because it blows out all the grass and garbage off to the side. So my guess is you could. By the time you're into heavy production, though, you really need to have, as Tom described, some kind of a ground cover that really is a perfect surface for picking up. Because as the light as the trees expand, there's not a lot of light on the surface anymore, so it's not going to be really good for harvest of a C3 crop like corn or wheat. Okay, but in the early years, there's tons of sunlight. The trees are small, the tree roots are not out into the rows, so you don't have below ground competition for water and nutrients or sunlight competition.
That'd really be, the winter wheat would only be applicable the first 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, maybe even to the 6th or 7th year. You know, once they start to roar, they really expand that canopy, but it takes a while. It does take a while. Yes, in the back.
Since you're working with Chinese chestnuts, have you done any investigation? Has your research involved at all looking at cultivars, new cultivars in China? Or is there are there breeding programs going on in China that you all can learn?
There's a lot of work going on in China, and you know, I've talked to a few, you know, there's a few people like Greg Miller who've been over there quite a few times. The question is, I mean, the Chinese are happy to take our germplasm. The question is, are they willing nowadays anyway to share back? And I'm not sure, but we very much want to get germplasm collections from their good material from central and northern part of the range. And that's never happened before.
So they do have breeding programs going on over there.
Right. And it's, I mean, Chinese chestnut to the Chinese is like maize is to the Native Americans. I mean, it's been there forever. So it's a major part of their diet. Everybody knows them. They're in every city and every street, everywhere. And interestingly, so one of the automatic ethnic groups that comes to our chestnut festival and even on campus that buys the chestnuts that we sell are the Chinese scholars or the Chinese people who've moved to the United States because they're hungry for stuff from home. So they buy by the multiple dozens of pounds. It's just real familiar. People from Southern Europe, same exact thing. Bosnians, same thing. Japanese, same thing. Koreans, same thing. Koreans are the largest chestnut consumers of any that, at least according to the global statistics that are out there. Yes?
Quick question on the maintenance of the tree side. You know, you shared that you went with the woven wire fencing.
The woven wire cage when they're young, yes.
Yeah. Is that something that was specifically studied beforehand, or is this just something where that was just the way that it was?
That's what we figured out to do. And for our situation, again, with these grafted trees, it worked really, really well. Maybe we just have enough climate warmth that we just don't need to put them in sort of a nice open greenhouse condition to get them to go, right? We also don't have to do as much pruning because they're not quite as vigorous. And when the trees are young, we actually want that lower scaffolding when they're young because we want more photosynthetic surface. But over time, we move it up so that ultimately, when you need to get equipment under there, the main scaffolding is above equipment height. Yes?
What method of grafting are you using on them, and are there some cultivars that tend to graft more poorly or better than others?
There's one of our very favorite ones does have a problem with delayed grafting compatibility, and that's Ching. It may be the highest performing cultivar, and we probably have 10% failure. You can use whip and tongue. You can use like what they call the banana graft, the 3-flap graft. There's lots of different methods. Whatever graft method you have a lot of confidence in, they all work. They all work.
Okay, I was hoping maybe that we could get Tom and Roger's thoughts on
All kinds of stuff.
yeah, all kinds of stuff, but grafted versus seedling, and then your varietal recommendations for both of you. We're going to break at 3 o'clock, so we've got till then to go through about whoever else wants to chime in.
Here we go. We'll pretend we're like CNN and we're the panel of the faces in the window.
Okay. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but since it came up, I want to address the issue of the Japanese-European hybrids. Now, as Mike said, a certain university, an off-brand university, made the claim that they discovered that the internal kernel breakdown issue was caused by Chinese chestnut pollen. And Well, that same meeting that I was telling you about in Michigan that I attended, where we discussed the spacing, we had somebody came up and claimed that the internal kernel breakdown, and that's just a polite way of saying rotten nuts, because that's what they are. The nuts are rotten, is caused by Chinese chestnut pollen. But then the very next guy that got up speaking was from Australia, and he said, well, we have that same issue in Australia, and we don't have any Chinese chestnut trees. But our Japanese European hybrids produce a lot of rotten nuts too. So, but that's not the only problem with those Japanese European hybrids. As Mike said, they're not very cold hardy, and they're not very blight resistant. Even when the nurseries claim they're blight resistant, they usually aren't. The Japanese European hybrids have very low level of.
There's no blight in Washington State, by the way.
Yeah, or practically. Yeah, yeah, just because a tree doesn't get blight in Washington doesn't mean if you plant it in Iowa, it's not going to get blight, because they will. And that's not the only problem either. I've had several opportunities to taste colossal chestnuts, which is a Japanese European hybrid, and. To me, they were bland with a very, very faint sweetness, and it was a good thing they were bland because the flavor they did have kind of reminded me of mud scraped up off the bottom of a stagnant pond. It was kind of a sewer gas-like flavor. Now, I did once get a chance to taste sweet colossal chestnuts, but they had been stored in controlled climate conditions for 10 months, so they were cured for 10 months, and they did have a faint sweetness. They were about as sweet as a Chinese chestnut would be after 2 days of curing. But it took 10 months to get these colossals that way. They also don't peel very well. And this is important. That means that the skin that covers the kernel doesn't come off very easily because the surface of the kernel is really convoluted on the Japanese European hybrids, including colossal. And it's important because that skin on the Japanese Europeans is thick and leathery and furry and bitter and astringent. On the Chinese, it comes off easily, but it's thin and papery and not much fur on it and has a pleasant flavor. There's just a lot of problems with the Japanese European hybrids, and they just aren't adapted to a continental climate. They're adapted to your Mediterranean climate where they have hot, dry summers and no precipitation during the summer. They get all the precipitation in the winter. And when they get precipitation during the growing season, they develop these rotten kernels. And it happens anywhere where they get rainfall in the summer. And in fact, that certain off-brand university was recommending that growers should acquire a CAT scan machine and then run each of their nuts through this CAT scan machine to filter out the rotten ones. And with that machine, they could get all the way up to 94% good nuts.
Okay. I was at that meeting. I don't remember them saying every farmer should get a cat, but they were showing the results of CAT scans.
Well, they gave instructions for how to go online and search for a CAT scan machine so you could get one. But you also had to have a computer software and some hardware that would blow the nut off of a conveyor belt. You had to have a conveyor belt. But anyway, don't plant colossals or Japanese European hybrids. Question?
This will go back to Missouri, but is there a published protocol for growing at the rootstock to graft to your
We do, again, on the center's website, we do have a growing Chinese chestnuts in Missouri guide that pretty much talks about all these different things that I covered. So I think that's a really good place to start. That'll answer a lot of questions, and then once you've looked through that and have more questions, that's also the time again to come back to meetings like this and get fine-tuned. But that's a good starting guide, and probably a lot of that's covered in your guide as well.
Yeah, I think so.
When do you have to spray for the weevil before that comes into harvest? How far before?
So within So we're spraying, our nuts are ripening. Our situation is a little complex only because we have so many cultivars. So our first cultivar, like Louisvilles Monster, is just about the first to drop. So once Louisvilles Monster start to drop, I go, oh my God, here we go again. But then it's going to be 5 more weeks until the last nuts of the last cultivar are dropping. But we are spraying at 10-day intervals in August, because we're pretty sure that the nuts are reasonably mature up in the burrs and that the weevils are starting to smell blood, so to speak, and so that's when we spray.
You spray more than once, don't you?
We spraying at 10-day intervals 3 times in August. Yes?
What are the land grant universities interested in more of the research and development of chestnuts, like Iowa State University?
Monsanto!
The land-grant universities, unfortunately, have really disinvested in a lot of practical horticulture over the last 35 years. And unless you live in a state that is a big horticulture state, which would Michigan, New York, Washington, Oregon, California, things like that, then if there's if there's a commodity group, they talk to the ag dean, money flows. There'll be a breeder, there'll be a pathologist, there'll be an entomologist, there'll be an economist, etc. Okay, but when you come to Iowa, you come to Missouri, you go to Minnesota, you go to Wisconsin, I don't think they're major hort states, and so the universities don't feel any pressure to address those constituencies. That's just the reality of you know, all of our states have disinvested in K through 12 and higher education since 1980, because it's been basically my career. And so back then, there was a lot of resources in the land grants, and they were able to work on a million different issues, major and minor. But as the squeeze happened, basically only the loudest, whether it's corn, soybeans, could be blueberries and cherries in Michigan, they invest in those existing winners. So it's hard to go from nowhere to somewhere and get the land grant to take to care. The weevils or the yeah, chestnut weevil.
We don't have either weevils or wasps in Iowa yet. We'll probably get them someday, but we don't have them.
Okay, so that's my question. So I'm a farmer who has a really hard time spraying chemicals that are of that type on my.
Yeah, and you don't have to spray. There are other methods you can use to control weevils, and there's no way to control wasps, except for the naturally occurring predators of the wasp.
Okay, so I mean, it's when I'm looking ahead, investing in something.
Right.
I guess as you look down the road, do you think for somebody of my bent that I'm doing a stupid thing by investing in this, given what you can see is the trajectory of these plants?
Well, because so the Empire Chestnut Company has a production setup for the hot water bath for weevils. So there is a way. There is a way. Yep. Eventually. So what happens?
Yeah, we will probably have to start soaking nuts in hot water someday if and when the weevils show up here. But they aren't here yet. The nearest are central Missouri right now. And we're hoping to keep them away.
People picking them at your farm, right? I mean, if you're saying you've kind of built your model of the people coming to your farm, if you're saying now we need this bath, that's kind of a totally opposite road of somebody picking them up off the ground, isn't it?
Yeah. And we will have to do something to control weevils someday if we get them. But we don't have them now. And so we don't have to deal with them. But we still have to address the issue, the counterpoint to the grafted chestnut issue too. So,
Go right ahead.
so we need to jump right into that.
Lover of colossal. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Now, our experience with grafted Chinese chestnuts goes back over 20 years, and our experience is very different from that of central Missouri. I think Mike is probably about at the northern limit of where grafted Chinese chestnuts would be viable. In Iowa, in my experience, when you plant grafted trees, about 40% of them will just suddenly die for no apparent reason. And this could happen anytime from 1 year after they're planted, clear up to 15 years later. And the longer it's delayed, the worse it is, because the more you have invested in that tree and the bigger it is. But 40% are going to die. Of the 60% that survive, there's going to be a really wide range of vigor. The most vigorous survivors will be maybe 80% as vigorous as a seedling tree. The worst will be about 5%. I have a 25-year-old grafted Chinese chestnut. The trunk is about this big around, and it produces about as many nuts as you can expect from a tree that size. But I would say on average, of the survivors, the average vigor or growth rate of those trees is about 20 to 30% compared to a seedling tree. Now, if you take 0.6 and multiply by 0.2, you get a pretty small number. So another way of putting this is if you were to plant 1 acre of seedling trees, and then right next to it 1 acre of grafted trees, and then follow their production over a period of 30 years, the seedling trees will outproduce those grafted trees by 500 or 600%. That's way too much to make grafted trees viable.
So I just want to say, and I made this comment about that we don't really have material that is even climatically ideally suited to Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Because we know that it works just that little bit further south in Columbia, Missouri, and it works really well. I think if we had the right rootstock and the right cultivars, I don't see why we shouldn't be able to replicate that here, but clearly we don't, which is why from Ohio to here, trial and error says just go with seedlings. And I can't argue with what works and what doesn't work. We just know that in our situation, as close as we are, there's this critical difference where the two different systems work well, but they're quite different.
Tom, you speak to the fact of not yet, when you refer to both the Wasp and the Weevil. There's a predictability factor that is used like for things such as the emerald ash borer. What kind of timeline are we looking at?
When will we get weevils and wasps? It could be this spring, or it could be 20 years from now. And it's just a matter of whether somebody brings them in or not, because they're not going to just move in on their own. Somebody's going to have to bring them. When that happens is anybody's guess. But anyway, getting back to the cultivars versus seedlings. Now, another thing that we have found is that when you take really good, genetically superior trees like Ching and Peach and Gideon and Mossbarger and cross them with each other and then plant the seedlings from them, most of the seedlings, maybe 90% plus of those seedlings, are going to grow up into trees that will produce nuts that are just as big and just as high quality as those parents were. If only one of the parents is a superior parent, it might be only 50%. But if both the parents are superior and have a track record of producing good seedlings, most of those seedlings are going to be commercial quality trees. And then if you plant them at 20 by 20 spacing and then remove 3/4 of them by the time they're 20 years old, what's you're going to have left is probably on average going to be better than the parents. And if you talk to people who've been in this business for years, people like Greg Miller in Ohio and Bob Staley in Ohio, Chestnut Charlie in Kansas, or me, people have been growing Chinese chestnuts for years. That far north, they will all say, don't plant grafted trees. Now, the grafted trees are good for one thing, and that is producing good seedlings. But don't depend on those for commercial nut production.
So you're lucky to have us.
Yeah. We are very lucky to have Mike here, and we're lucky to have the University of Missouri doing this research. There are no other universities anywhere in North America that are doing this kind of research that Missouri is doing. And there's been other universities that started, like Auburn and California, Davis, and a few others that started doing chestnut research, but as soon as the professor who was doing that retired, they just dozed out the trees. Missouri is the only one that's made the commitment in land and infrastructure and personnel to actually do serious research on a long-term basis.
Yeah. For the seeds that you provide, you know, the known cultivars, they come from cultivars from your orchard, grafted trees?
Yes. Yes.
But in the past, we got some from Missouri Agroforestry Center.
Yeah. The seeds we provide come from grafted trees, whether they're from our farm or from Missouri.
I was just wondering where you're located. You said that's in the Les area?
It's river hills that have very deep lush soils, real close to the river.
So
They're right in the middle of Missouri.
so you're working, are you working with like 5 to 10 foot of topsoil?
Or more.
Okay, so that's a big difference than Iowa here for us. So maybe that's part of the difference between why the grafting is in such a different environment?
Yeah, it could be that if he was trying to do this on not quite as good a soil, it wouldn't work in central Missouri.
We have a lot of restricted clay pan soils in a lot of Missouri. And realistically, we as human beings, if we own a plot of land and we hear about something exciting, let's call it a chestnut, we feel that it's going to work on our farm because it's my farm. And unfortunately, if the soils aren't really well adapted, it just won't. So what you find, and this happens also with people that fall in love with black walnut, and they plant it in a soil that's not deep and it's not really that well suited on the site index for walnut, is that the first few years they seem to do fine. But once they start to get larger and get to that point, for example, with chestnuts, where they want to start bearing, they're not going to have enough moisture. They're not going to have a deep enough root system. And so unless you have a tremendous amount of investment in irrigation, et cetera, you're going to have a really low crop yield with tiny little nuts. So they'll struggle on and they'll grow, but they won't thrive. And you don't want to try to put something that has a 2,000 pound potential in a site that's only going to achieve 500 pounds on the best day. I mean, you oughtn't do that, really.
Yeah, that's why we say it's really important to look at your soils. There was another question?
Yeah, you talk about the cultivars now, but what about maybe I missed, but what about the rootstock? Because I know, will that affect how the tree grows? Will it be more dwarf? Will it affect the height?
Yeah, the question is, what about the rootstock? There is no clonal rootstock available for chestnuts, so it's all seedling rootstock. So you're going to have a lot of variability with the rootstocks. And that brings up one more point about grafted trees. One of the arguments for grafted trees is that you get uniformity in ripening time and uniformity in nut size. But that doesn't happen with Chinese chestnuts, at least not in Iowa. I've had 2 Mossbarger chestnuts, for example, growing side by side, 40 feet apart on the same soil. And some years the ripening time is in perfect sync, and other years one of them will start dropping nuts just as the other one's finishing. So that uniformity of ripening time you can't depend on. And And nut size you can't depend on being uniform either. You can have two trees grafted to the same variety and have one of them overbearing and producing small nuts, and one right next to it, same variety, same soil, producing extra large nuts.
Now, to carry on with that, is the Center for Agroforestry doing any research or future research into developing a clonal rootstock?
It's certainly something that we're really interested in, but with our limited resources of things we can do, that's because we know when we look out in the horticulture world, of course, the most obvious place to look is apples. And the apples have developed all these different rootstocks so that you have fully dwarfed Malling 9, Malling 26, all these different specific rootstocks, and it makes a very different sized tree. Knowing all those things, you know, that's in our heads, but we haven't even gotten past all the cultivars yet to really deal with a uniform rootstock. But that is an important thing. When you get to, for example, a giant like the English walnut in California with 200,000 acres and a huge amount of resources and a bunch of research, they've done a tremendous amount of research on different rootstocks. So they have 1,000-fold more resources and researchers, and they have gotten to that point for that very, very large industry. You know, if our industry gets large enough, we can start looking at finer and finer and important questions, because it's a good question.
Yeah, but they don't have clonal rootstocks. It will probably never be possible to produce clonal rootstocks for chestnuts because clonal rootstocks are created by layering, and chestnuts just don't layer well. So it'll probably never happen.
Almost true. There is one of those European Japanese cultivars that we're not interested in anyway. I think it's called Marsol, that seems to root layer to a reasonable degree, but has no bearing on any of our work. It's just not the right thing. But generally, that's what Tom said is a completely true statement. Yes?
So, almost change the subject. When you guys are doing your 20 by 20 or 30 by 30 plantings, and then you're thinning, what good are those secondary products? Is the wood good for firewood, for wood carving, woodworking, smoking? What use is that secondary product that would otherwise be waste?
So the woodworking, the market is for people that do bowls and gun stocks and flutes and pens. So there's a lot of interest in chestnut wood from, for example, a Chinese chestnut for that whole marketplace. So it is viable for that.
Mike, has there been any research on tree spading those thin?
We did a little bit of that, and the trees almost never recovered. These were maybe 12 years old, and we picked them up and moved them, and
They don't survive well. If they do survive, they never start growing.
they survived and they didn't thrive. So that's a really big expense too, to take a Vermeer tree spade and plop it from one place to another. But it's a good idea. Obviously, it works for ornamental trees in people's yards, and if you put a big tree in your yard, you don't care how much it grows bigger, so much.
Was there a certain size associated with not work well?
Tree spading,
Like a 2-inch tree? Or
2-year-old, like thumb size.
yeah, ours were older, and we thought we had a reason to try to save them and move them rather than start over, but we thought we'd try. It didn't work.
Is there less graft rejection if you take the seed from the tree you're going to take the seedlings from? Did I hear that?
We've certainly done that. So we've grafted Ching on Ching seedlings.
It helps, but not enough for Iowa.
Because you're,
Question about the bugs, going back to that. Will the weather affect them? Is there some place too far north where the chestnut?
No, the bug will go at least as far north as the trees.
up here.
Can you reiterate the varieties that you recommend for production that you think are good in this area?
Now, all the ones Mike mentioned, yeah, what varieties do I recommend? Ching, Peach, Gideon, Mossbarger. We have a few locally developed trees that they don't have down in Missouri, one we call Shotgun and Red Fern Super, and now Ching Su. Mike mentioned, well, yeah, seedlings from Louisvilles Monster, if they're crossed with Chinese, make good trees for a lot farther north. But if you can grow pure Chinese, that's what you should be growing. Louisvilles Monster is a hybrid. And he talked about Sleeping Giant. Sleeping Giant itself is a good tree, but it doesn't seem to produce good seedlings. So even if Sleeping Giant is crossed with another good tree, the seedlings are below average. So we don't use Sleeping Giant as one of the breeding parents.
I have the privilege of talking to probably more chestnut customers than anybody else in this area, other than maybe Greg Miller. And I can tell you, taste is a very big attribute to the people that buy chestnuts from growers in this area. And the reason I say that is because we compete with growers from northern Florida and Michigan, and we sell our chestnuts at a premium because we can and the customers want them. So you want to plant the trees that produce the nuts that people want. Which are the chestnuts that Tom mentioned. You don't want to, I can tell you from personal experience, because I've seen this many, many times, you don't want to plant the chestnut trees that come out of Florida. You don't want to plant the chestnut trees that come out of Michigan. You want to plant the chestnut trees that come out of Missouri and Red Fern Farm. They're marketable, and there's a high degree of marketability with those trees. They bring a premium, and I charge a premium.
Are there universities in China that are looking at paralleling doing the work that you're doing? That obviously they've got a lot more interest in that. Is there information from them and sources? And what do you use from China as far as the research?
Up to this point, the main thing that we're beginning to be able to do in comparison with China is when we do molecular work on our trees and they do it on theirs, we can actually begin to figure out where ours came from. Their systems tend to be, Tom mentioned like a 3 by 7 foot spacing on Chinese chestnut. That also means that they have 1,000 hands there to do constant pruning and compassing and labor. So they have very, very different systems, and their different states or provinces don't really play well together. So that the chestnut program in one of their provinces doesn't really collaborate nicely with a program in another, or another one in another. And so, at least at the University of Missouri, we have not yet developed any strong collaborations with Chinese institutions. That's probably going to change because the person who is our center economist is from China. And so we're finally going to have some easier inroads for colleagues to ask these questions. And I think over time, we'll develop those relationships so that it can strengthen our Midwest chestnut program.
Those were all seedlings. All seedlings from our farm. Chinese chestnuts. They were seedlings, so they were seedlings of Ching and Peach and Gideon and Mossbarger and actually some just unknown parentage. But they were good, right? I think.
Let me ask about genetic engineering. It's like all the holes seem to be removed on what investigating, genetic engineering.
Yes. So the questions about genetic engineering. There, I'll go to the American chestnut story. So the American Chestnut Foundation has had this backcross breeding program crossing susceptible American chestnuts to resistant Chinese, and then back crossing to American and American and American, and selecting those few seedlings that keep inheriting that gene of resistance. So 35 years out now, they're not quite there yet with their backcross 3F3 generation. There's a group at State University of New York at Syracuse that has genetically inserted a gene from wheat that produces oxalic acid, and they can introduce that gene into American chestnut, and they are completely blight resistant. The question is, are we worried about what? Are we worried about that? Are we worried that if you take a gene from anything other than chestnut, like wheat, and you're introducing something that produces something that Chinese has that doesn't allow the fungus to become a problem? So that gets into a very large debate about genetically modified organisms, and it's actually going to become a larger issue now because there's a technique, and maybe if everybody's heard it if you've looked in 1,000 magazines in the last few years, called CRISPR. And CRISPR means you don't necessarily even have to go to some other organism. You can just sort of like slice and dice the DNA that's there. So maybe there's a way that we can understand the DNA of chestnut itself, of American versus Chinese, and sort the problem like that. It's still a technology where you're manipulating right at the DNA level, at the where the double strands meet and disconnect, A, T, C, G, etc. And the question is are we going to be comfortable with that? I don't know. But the technology is already actually there to do that. To be gluten-free, you're talking to the wrong guy. Well, chestnuts are gluten-free, so we got that one. Wheat is not, right. Right, so if you put wheat into a chestnut that's now blight resistant, will it produce a nut that is not gluten-free? Probably it's going to be fine. I think the nuts are going to be fine. 3 o'clock? Time for Roger? Time for Kathy? Okay, break.